So maybe if we could start by you telling us a little bit about this farm and how long it's been in your family and general history about the farm, perhaps.
Well, when the railway came to Liverpool, various people who previously worked in London, lived in London, moved down to the country with their families, and one of them was the stockbroker Alexander Scrimgeour, and he gave his daughters a stone farmhouse each. So this one was his daughter Ruth's house, and they'd had it from 1872. And she was a horse and pony breeder, so she didn't have much money because she had all these animals to feed. And my mother lived a mile away, and it was much more exciting down here because Edwardian children had to dress up in frilly dresses and go out to tea with their mother, you know. So she used to come down here with all the ponies and riding school things going on down here. And my mother really was a niece to Ruth Scrimgeour. This house was left to the two of them when Ruth Scrimgeour died.
Right.
And she ran a riding school for years at Selsey.
And so Ruth Scrimgeour is your great aunt, is that right?
Well, she's the equivalent of my great aunt. She's the Scrimgeour people who owned this house, you see. So she left it to my parents when she died. But
oh, she wasn't related to them?
No, but she was good as. You know, we called her aunt, you know, in the way one does. So she was, by way of being great aunt to me and aunt to them. And also, after the First World War, she bought 100 acres of the coast to the west of Selsey, which had no access, so they used to go along the beach with the horses. And that is the land where they let the sea in now, called Medmerry and Thorney Farm.
Yes.
And it's really annoying that they haven't mentioned us at all, and it's only because of my mother that existed, because they were going to put a nuclear power station there.
Oh.
And my mother got this thing going in no time at all with help to get that publicised. And apart from that bit of land letting the sea in, it's covered with caravans and things, Selsey.
I know it.
You do you? Yes. Anyway,
I remember Medbury because they create a natural harbour. That was the idea, wasn't it?
Well, we used to. It took a long time. It was acquired by the military in the war, and it was a bombing range, so they could drop things off the coast. And they wouldn't let us have it back for a long time. I mean, 1945, you'd have thought we'd have got it back, you see, and we could do with more grazing for the ponies. And we didn't get it back till 55. I can remember coming to my grandparents' house at Hookland in Redford. I can remember being allowed to come to lunch there when I was about 3, providing I had my afternoon rest or whatever. So I remember that, and I remember coming along. It was very difficult to get to here because really all the roads were bushy and never trimmed back. I can remember coming along and stopping at the house called the Hollies, which is the next one along. But I wasn't often allowed to go to my grandparents' place. I mean, it was 20 miles away, and at that age I had to be looked after. And I'm one of 6 girls, so there were rather a lot of people needing places in the car.
And so these were unmade roads leading here then?
Well, this one there was quite good, actually. The Duchess of Bedford lived at the big house in the 1930s, and rather she kept her Rolls Royces there. And
what's the big house called?
Whispers. So this was part of the Whispers estate, as it were. And she'd made up the roads and done the ditching and everything because she was rather a distinguished lady, the Duchess of Bedford. She was the one who flew everywhere, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So this is in the interwar years, presumably?
Yes, in the 1930s, yes.
But you actually grew up at Madehurst?
I grew up at Madehurst, and I'd lived there, and I can remember the first calf being born in when I was 2, so that was 41. And I can remember going up to see our old London house in 1941. My Baron grandfather lived in Leeds. That's where the Barons come from. And we used to go up there every summer during the war, so it was quite exciting going an extra way around London to see this house. And that dates when it was sold, actually. Everyone was asking me when was it sold. Well, I went there in 41, so it was sold about then. We lived in Madehurst Lodge, which is a beautiful Regency house which looks down the valley. And we had a small acreage there and what you'd call a small holding. We had a couple of dairy cows to milk and far too many horses. But you did ride them then in those days and drive them, so it wasn't all useless horses. Large black pigs and various sorts of poultry. And a huge walled garden it had was a house that age, you know. So.
And do you remember anything particular about rural life then that would mark it out as being different from now?
Well, we rode everywhere or went in the pony cart when we were too small to stay on by ourselves. And there were 3 dairy farms in the village, mixed farms, and they were all active, and we rode all over those and picked cowslips and mushrooms and all the rest of it. And now there's nothing but arable. The last farm has been sold, and I don't know what they're doing with it, but I dare say it'll be arable. And the whole thing is just an open prairie of corn. I don't think they even grow rape there. It's just wheat and barley. And it's farmed from a neighbouring village, so there's no farm machinery in the village whatsoever. And the buildings are let for residential, they're rented out for residential properties. So it's very, very dull farming-wise. So it's a beautiful little valley, Madehurst. And you can see, you know, well, from our house you can see down the valley without interruption of buildings and things. In those days one could ride everywhere, there were gates.
So on horse you're talking?
On a pony, yes, and things, and we fell off and the ponies went home without us and that sort of thing. It's quite an adventure. But nowadays the roads are quite busy with, well, at weekends, with people going up the downs by car, which they shouldn't be. So the village itself is, if you can't go in the fields, it's rather dull for riding, but if you go a little bit farther, you're in the lovely woods. And that was all open woodland. And during the war, the army had it all. There was trenches everywhere. And it was I remember that very clearly. It was very busy French Canadians till D-Day. Then they had all the parade of all the tanks and everything, which ruined the roads, of course, because the lanes are too narrow for big military vehicles. And Monty held a review at our drive gates, which is rather nice.
Oh, goodness.
White gates. Yeah. And of course, my mother and the governess we had, and usually a few conscientious objectors we could get to help on the farm, sort of thing. They didn't realise that D-Day was taking place. My 2 sisters up did. And then it was absolutely quiet, you know, from having been full of army, the whole village. All the other houses in the village were occupied by the French Canadians. We were the only people who stayed, really. Oh. And the other farms, yes.
So that must have been...
It was very...
For you as a child, you must have just assumed...
Well, I was a bit scared because you weren't allowed to accept chewing gum or anything like that from the soldiers. They took over our house. The brigadier took over our house once, and my mother was invited to supper with the governess in full evening clothes for dinner. What she didn't know, what my sister did, was that the army had caught some of our chickens, and it was her chickens that they were serving up.
So where did you all live when?
Well, they didn't want the bedroom. They had our bicycle shed as HQ.
Oh, I see.
A little wooden shed.
So you were still sleeping there?
Yes. No, it was just the kitchen they took over. I think just for that meal, really. Oh. They needed somewhere for HQ during all this goings on, you know, and there was a lot of shrubbery and treescape round the house, so that was all army encampments, as frying chips and everything, which we'd never heard of. Yes.
So
And they were all over the Downs, the army as well, so it was quite busy till D-Day.
It must have seemed so quiet afterwards then.
Yes. And my memories, which are quite difficult to date, is that the roads, of course, were ruined by all the army stuff. I can remember when they first redid the roads, they put the tar down and one strip of gravel, and then they went up a mile up the road to the Downs to finish it off up there. And my little friend and I found how lovely it was to paddle in warm tar. We started off with the sandals, and then we knew we were ruining those. So we took the sandals off and went barefoot. And warm, sticky tar is absolutely gorgeous on one's feet. And I've never forgotten that. And then we had the problem of how to get ourselves home with these sticky feet and being caught and feet doused in petrol or whatever they could find to try and get the tar off.
The people who lived in Madehurst in the 1940s,
Yeah.
what was their occupation and how was that different to the people who live there now?
Well, after the war, there were 120 people in Madehurst, 60 of whom were children, 9 of whom were called Linda. So I always wonder which film star they were called after. Yes, so some of the farm families had a lot of children. And I can remember the farm below us, he wasn't getting on very well. I think he may have been ill, and I don't think he had much family, but he gave up. And at that stage, it was sort of changing from one horse to one tractor, so he was not making a living. And a nice go-ahead chap with a pedigree Guernsey herd and a milk round and lots and lots of sheep. We'd never seen sheep. Though the Downs were covered with sheep in 1920, say. It had stopped. The only sheep one saw were a few store lambs that were bought in the market just to fatten. But anyway, this farmer had lambs, Jacob sheep, the first Jacob sheep, and quite a big go-ahead farm, yes. But the farm behind us was one where the farmer went to market and got drunk every week, but he used to buy in his dairy cattle, and his son had to drive him. And they had 8 mainly Suffolk Punch working horses. Now, they were, very, very noticeable. It was right at the back of our house, so if we went out with the dog or anything, or we had to be careful because the horses, when they were turned out, would chase our dogs. And we had lurchers, especially for catching rabbits, so we used to catch 6 rabbits a trip. Anyway, I didn't notice them going. They just went. And he used to breed one every other year, a new one. And the whole farm was worked with horses, behind us, and they just disappeared, The family was still there, but the horses went, yes.
And sad. So most of the men were agricultural labourers in the village, were they?
Yes. During the war, the keepers worked on the farms. They weren't allowed to do much keeping, but they used to shoot us rabbits and things. So the keepers stayed in as farm labourers, and the farm workers stayed too. But, we didn't have any masculine help. All my sisters, we did all the farm things ourselves. We milked the cows and broke in the horses and all the rest of it, So from a very early age, our thing was doing it all ourselves. We did have a gardener, of course, so he grew good vegetables, yes. But it really changed. It didn't change till about 1960, actually, when the farms started becoming all arable. Before that, there were, ordinary-sized fields and hedges and everything. And what really has changed is there were water troughs in every field, of course, and there you would get a bit of puddled earth. There's nowhere for the house martins, which we protected, to get their mud from. They have to fly, 6 miles or so, and even then there are no water troughs. So it's quite difficult. My mother used to put out mud for them later on because it's quite difficult for them to get anything to build their nests with. And things like that people have not thought of. And certainly things like mushrooms you don't get without the grazing animals' dung and the water troughs and things. And what we were all concerned about was the lack of cowslips. And that was interesting because all our fields had cowslips. And it isn't that the farmers put weed killer on the fields, it's that they were taking off the silage or the hay and feeding it in the sheds. If you want the cowslips to persist, you've got to rest them in the flowering season and transport the hay with the cowslip seeds in it to other fields so it grows up. But each individual cowslip plant will last for 15 years. Really? But if you don't let them come back, we ploughed up one field in 1942, and that took really till 1965 for them to spread across it, because we kept a stallion in that field, so we never made hay in that field. So there were cowslips all around the edges, but it wasn't till he went sort of that the cowslips spread across the whole field. So that was very sad, because they were all thick all over the fields, as they are in some parts of England now. But where they're not disturbed, they'll grow to sort of 12 or 15 inches high in the hedges and things.
And has there been generally a loss of wildflowers, wild birds?
Well, only that the farmland is very boring now. Things like turtle doves, I mean, we had a lot of those when I was young, but turtle doves haven't been heard much. There's not enough varied hedges and little bits of wood. I mean, there's still woodland because they've got 2 or 3 keepers there, so they like plenty of cover for the pheasants. So that hasn't changed. The pheasants are still there. What has changed is we used to hunt rabbits with lurchers, and we did wonder whether there was a badger's set. But now there are badger sets all over the ground, and they do an awful lot of harm. What I hadn't realised is that it's not compatible with pheasant farming, badgers, so in the old days they had to keep them down because they reared the pheasant chicks out in the fields. And badgers will destroy a wooden chicken house, just in a night. So it wasn't just that foxes will eat things. They don't keep the foxes down anymore. But it's very boring land for the foxes, so they're not that many. But we had free-living bantams from 1939 to about the 60s, and they were decimated by the foxes because the foxes will come round at 6 in the morning in the summer, and the bantams would get down from the trees then and get picked off when foxes knew they were perfectly safe to do so. So what happens in a shooting type village has certainly changed. I don't think the pheasants particularly enjoy acres and acres of barley when it's been, once it's been cut. The land is very, very boring, so I imagine that they regret it a bit because it doesn't hold as many pheasants on the land as it used to.
But the woodland is still much as it was, is it?
Well, it's owned by the Green family, Madehurst, and they are timber merchants at heart, yes. Own Shoreham Harbour and various covers in Chichester, so woodland is still their thing. But I don't think several of the cottages were occupied by woodsmen when I was young. I mean, the senior one, and the other thing that went is there was a sawmill in every village on the downs, and the one in our village was staffed by the prisoners of war. But there was one here, and there were ones along Charlton and those villages along there. Each village, downland village, had a sawmill.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
And going back to the village, and the people who lived there, they were rural people. Were they distinguished by local accents? And
the village school closed down just at the end of the war because there were too many 14-year-old boys for the school teacher to cope with. It was a tiny school. I think then they all went to school in Arundel and Littlehampton, so they would have lost they hadn't got a rural school anymore, so they would have lost their country accents.
That in and around Slindon there was a bus, the Silver Queen bus.
Yes.
Which was made out of...
oh, was it? Yeah. Yes. Well, that was our nearest bus in that direction. It's 2.5 miles to Slindon Common where the bus got. There's the Spur at Slindon Common, you know, was a very good roadhouse pub. And that was at a garage there, so our cars were done up there. But the buses went from Slindon Common to Bognor and Chichester, and the Silver Queen was one of them, you know.
I remember people saying that the bus driver would stop for anybody or wait for someone to get their child's shoes on before he headed off.
Yes. Well, I mean, the buses, we used to, from Madehurst, our nanny was rather lonely because she'd been living in London before the war, sort of thing, with us. My family lived in Camden Hill Square, so she had a fairly social life with lots of other nannies in London. But she used to take us out to tea. People used to go out, that thing has changed tremendously. People used to go, there wasn't food in pubs, and women didn't go into pubs anyway, but there were tea houses everywhere. And Nanny used to bicycle us down, or used to catch the bus to go down to Amberley, where there were 2 or 3 little tea establishments. People would hire a boat and go on the river. But my mother spent a lot of time, well, we all did, doing acting and country dancing and singing. We used to do singing things. And that was all for the village, really. So we had a Christmas tableau in the church and things, because nothing went on in Madehurst, you know, and we used to do country dancing and try and invite all the village in, etc. And singing as well, so they joined in with that, which was nice. But no, they've got a pavilion, cricket pavilion, which can do weddings and funerals now. So.
And were the traditional songs sung?
Well, we did, because we were involved with Set of Shop and all the things. And I think one of the things I looked on the internet about your delvings was that Tony Wales was mentioned in one of these, and my mother used to go to sing with Tony Wales. I can't quite remember whether it was a Tuesday or which day of the month it was, but he used to be in Horsham, and my mother and whoever else was in the house would go over there and sing, but not me. I won't sing on my own. I will join in with other people a bit, but so I was the loner musical-wise, because I don't play anything and I won't sing much if anyone's going to listen to me. Yes.
Do you remember any of the names of the songs that were sung?
Well, we had, because the tractors took over, we were lucky in 1949 or 50 to get one of the last old carters. Now, he was really, his language was really primitive. He used a lot of words which we didn't know about, you know. But anyway, we had 2 small cobs, and he worked those for ploughing and harrowing and haymaking over at Madehurst. And then they'd come over here and do a lot of here. And he was really old-fashioned, because he'd never learnt to drive a tractor. When the working horses disappeared, he was without a job and was quite glad to come to us, which is only a small holding. And after that, we had another chap called George Belton. Ah. Yes. I know. Now, we found out, we used to come over twice a week and have lunch with him here, everything, so quite a lot of talking was done. And it was a long time before we realised that he would sing, because we used to have these folk singing things, and he would do the beer and things like that. But we didn't know that he sang. And he'd lived on the boundaries of Surrey, Kent and Sussex all his life. And in those days, if you would sing a song, you got a free beer. So he and his father both sang, and it was mainly music-hall things that he thought we'd like to hear. It took quite some time to get him to dig up folk songs and things. So he had one that he used to sing very often called Jim the Carter's Lad and things. Yeah. And when he retired, it made a nice job for him that he used to get invited to various universities to do folk singing, because he'd never driven. So he used to get carted around by the BBC, I mean, originally from Tony Wales, I think, to sing. Because he was a genuine, he was about 5'2", and he used to have a lot of problems when being interviewed for jobs, because farmers used to shake his hand to see how horny it was, to see he'd been out of work. And he had the softest hands you could imagine. It's nothing to do with how much work he was doing, yes.
And what was his job?
Well, just farm, farm. He could thatch, he could hedge lay, he could do everything, you see, as well as the horses. I mean, the horses only worked at some times in the year.
And did he come from Stedham then originally?
No, he came from the boundaries of Surrey.
Oh,
Kent,
yes, you said, yeah.
And a lot of hop growing, and also ploughing competitions with the horses. I mean, that's what they really liked. It was glamour.
Did he have a big beard?
No.
No, I'm thinking
yes.
I'm thinking of another.
Very short and clean shaven,
singer.
Yes. But farmers used to, other farm workers used to tease him and get him to carry. In those days, you had to carry 100-weight sacks of 100-weight and a half. And he was only 5'2", so they would always get him to carry the heaviest things because they thought it would show him up, which it didn't, because he'd been doing it all his life,
Yeah.
Had his ways of doing it. So that was quite interesting, because it was sort of east of here he was telling us about all the time.
And he died in the 60s, I suppose?
No, he retired in 65, I suppose. And he would have lived for at least another 10 years. He lived near Chichester. But it did make folk singing did make an interesting job for his retirement.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, amazing.
We've got lovely water, and we had lovely water at home. We had a very deep well at Madehurst, which kept on being, every sort of 50 years or so, they put it down deeper. My mother was very concerned about water, that as to whether it was going to, all this building on the south coast was going to make the water level go down. Funnily enough, here, the water table's rising. We get, wet places appearing where we don't want them. So I don't know that that's necessarily true. But when my grandfather bought Madehurst Lodge in 1922 or 3, that was the only drinking water for the village, that they used to come and get it. And at that time, it would have been worked by paraffin, kerosene, I think, the well. But in my use, it's put onto electricity. Well, it was oil powered, because I remember it smelling, the well house. And then it was put onto electricity, so that the water at Madehurst Lodge was pumped up. There were big rainwater tanks at the back of the house, just underground, well, about 3 foot high, and that could be used for washing. We had two taps always in every place, because there was drinking water which came from the well, and there was this roof water, which not so clean for bathing, and everything.
Oh, you bathed in roof water?
Well, it's perfectly clean. It was stored underground, you see, so it's perfectly clean. I mean, when you get a rainstorm, most of the water goes straight into the guttering, and down into there. So there were 2 pumps. It was a little bit complicated. The gardener used to do it. One to pump up rainwater into the roof tanks, and one to pump the well water, which was rather jealously guarded in case we used too much well water, to well water into the roof as well, which is quite interesting. And we didn't water the garden. There was water from the greenhouse roofs and things, but we didn't, like everyone does now, have a sprinkler on all the time in the walled gardens, And they were lovely. one of the reasons the walled garden's lovely is because the animals couldn't get into it, apart from Mr. Green's pheasants. But the horses and cattle, when they got out occasionally, or other people's ones, the walled garden was strongly enclosed by walls, yes. And they didn't even know about it, the animals. Occasionally a small pony would be led through.
Do you remember from your time in Madehurst anything about folklore, superstitions?
Not really, because my mother wasn't at all superstitious. Her family had been in this neighbourhood for a long time because her grandfather lived at Hollycombe, just outside Liphook. So she knew everything from there when she was young, and I don't really think there was much superstition, and
or amongst the village people?
Well, they used to talk about the people who lived in our house before us were called Marshbanks, which is spelt Marjorie Banks. And like children always do, they'd always invent stories about their ghosts. They were buried in the churchyard quite successfully, but about their ghosts being seen. But it was just that people need something to talk about, It wasn't.
I asked that really because I remember reading a long time ago reports of large white ghostly horses at Madehurst that people saw and reported.
Oh, that was our horse, yeah. We had a white stallion, we had 2 stallions at Madehurst, he's riding one, and he pranced along. There's a field in front of the house with a road between the lawn, and that was his field. And when people went along with a pony, they didn't know that if it's a male stallion, if you're on a mare, you have to trot smartly by because the mare might want to stop. And if it's a gelding you're riding, you also have to trot smartly by because geldings and stallions will fight a bit. They'll paw the ground and there's only a fence between them. So that was very dramatic, and he looked lovely too because he was white, like all grey horses. He was white in his old age, yes. So he lived there for 28 years. It was his field, you see.
Oh, that explains that story then.
Yes, and it was my sister's horse, my little sister, who's only 5'2", and she used to ride him. And my sister didn't have any brakes. I mean, she always liked going fast in a car or on a horse. So luckily, he didn't go very fast. And with the stallion, you have to go in front, unless it's been very well trained. You have to go in front because if it has other horses in front of it, it will start making a lot of noise, calling to them and everything. So,
you said you were a doctor. So did
yes.
You went to university presumably?
Yes, I trained in London, and it used to just be done here at weekends. Yes.
And you had a career. So did any of your other sisters work permanently on the farm? Was that their livelihood?
Well, there's a book about my older sister Mary called Farming with Mary that you'd like to see.
I'll have a look in a moment, yeah.
Yes, and she's 16 years older than me, and she only died 3 years ago. So we had a marvellous funeral up on her farm in Yorkshire, processing up the hillside and burying her on the hillside, yeah. And my brother-in-law, she was quite busy in her old age compiling these things, but it's my brother-in-law that put them together. They were both school teachers at one time. So she used to farm here, and then later on she worked for the Soil Association, and she kept a few sheep and geese wherever she was. I mean, we've got farming and making compost in the blood, in that she collected, she got sheep and geese, which she didn't know anything about, up in Staffordshire, and she took them up to Yorkshire, and she did everything. She was used to horses here, working horses, cobs and things, but and she could milk a cow, but she was busy and energetic, so we didn't usually trust her to milk the cow or feed the chickens or anything, because she'd always forget she was doing something else. So she did general farming. I mean, she knew how to here. My next sister was more of a gardener. Next one married young, and we all did horses because we broke the horses in, the ponies ourselves. and you use them for riding. I mean, we rode all over the downs and everything, so I wouldn't have explored the downs on foot very well. I didn't like walking to that extent. But one did go everywhere by horse in those days, and one would have horsey picnics and things, And sister number 4 makes compost and things, but she's terrified of animals, really. She's a very nervous person, so had to be very careful when she said she wanted to ride something, because something would always go wrong. And the next sister, they're older than me, she did the farm before I did it. So really, my older sister and then sister number 5 and then me have done the farm all along. Theoretically, my mother was doing it, and that she didn't let us have any say in anything, but we usually knew how to get round that.
So how did it come about that you lived here then?
My mother was ill too, she had an operation. So my mother said, would I like to take over the farm here? That was in '66, so I used to do it at weekends from London.
And you were working as a doctor?
Yes. It's a bit difficult getting your hands dirty at weekends.
And were you a GP?
No, I did in hospital work. In fact, I started very late and I stopped early, so I didn't work for very many years as a doctor, but I do miss it all the time, and particularly when everyone's so short of staff nowadays.
So did you have a specialism?
No, I did everything, yes.
But in a hospital?
But yes, a lot of broken bones and casualty and things, yes.
So when did you give up being a doctor?
82 or 3, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So,
I had a flat in London so, that time.
And every weekend you had to come down here to...
We had the chap in the cottage would caretake the animals and do basic feeding things, yes, because he was used to doing that. He'd been here since 1950 or something, so he died in his 80s only a few years ago. So, and he was a rose grower. He used the garden and various plots of land for growing roses. And he'd been used to us. We used to have the Dartmoor pony stallions here and things, so he was used to handling Dartmoor stallions and things, so he was good with animals as well.
So you came to live here permanently in the 80s, did you?
This house, we had very nice tenants in it for years and years, but this house had no sanitation, hadn't been modernised at all.
So no running water?
Yes, there was running water, pumped. And in 1955, my mother did everything with the people in the cottage because she admired real, country staff having them. So that didn't have any water, the cottage. It used to be carried up from the house. But so she put on a bathroom for them. And in 1955, we tapped into the water supply for the big house here. So we had piped water from 1955. But it's a very long pipeline and it takes a lot of maintaining now. So
you mentioned your elder sister has passed away.
Yeah.
Are your other sisters still alive?
My sister number 5's in Scotland outside Stirling, and they don't drive about much, and anyway they've been shut down, as it were. She's still alive, and she rings me up more often now because of the lockdown and things.
So you all moved away, really, apart from
yes,
you who stayed
and that's
here?
the reason I have this house. I mean, I thought that one of my married sisters with children was going to want to be here. I was single, and I didn't see that it was particularly suitable for me, and I thought one of them would move here, but they haven't, My elder sister was up in Yorkshire on the wild North Walks and York's Moors, and so it's quite difficult to see each other if you've got a big place. I mean, she was very busy up there, so I didn't. It's nice to have this book that was written about it, because I didn't go up there that often, and she didn't have the time to come down here.
Do you have any family at all in?
Yes, my
West?
cousins live at Redford. That's my mother's family over there. So, and they've got far too many children. They've got 8 grandchildren,
Wow.
And by the end of this year they're going to have 11. So that's 4 daughters.
It's a tribe.
With about 8 granddaughters and no one to carry on the name, you know. Their name is Caulfield. My grandfather was in the Navy, so his name is dying out, and my grandmother came from Hollycombe, which is the Hawkshaw family, and there's quite a lot of books about Sir John Hawkshaw at present. He was an engineer, and someone kindly wrote a book about him.
Barran.
Barran, yes, the Barran is a Yorkshire family. They had a little farm attached to the house up there, but which was farmed, and my father was good with horses. Well, everyone was in those days. He was in the First World War with a gun team, if you were good with horses. The ordinary soldiers during the First World War had never sort of seen a horse before. Well, I'd seen a milk horse before, but they had to have someone in the team who knew about horses, otherwise horses wouldn't have survived the war.
No.
So he was in the First World War with a black gun team. And they were clothing manufacturers, the Barrons. So that was what... it's quite interesting how people move around. I mean, my great-grandfather's father made guns for Wellington in Highgate, you know, King's Cross and Highgate they lived. And he sent his 4 sons out to make their livings, and my one went up to Leeds and started making all the tailors and people were working in little cottages, you know, weaving and that sort of thing, and it was poor lighting and fairly poor conditions, and he put them all into factories, and he was the first workers' canteens and things like that. So it was quite interesting going up to Leeds and hearing all about that. And we used to go to Leeds for holidays because up north you can get out to the countryside so quickly. Whereas from London you've got acres and acres of suburbia to go through, which is not very interesting to live in, suburbia. So I've been lucky always to either live in the country here or on the outskirts of Leeds, which was the last bit of country up there.
Caroline mentioned that you knew about the Gypsies, or you had...
Yes, that gypsy caravan up here, she was... they were horse dealers and breeders like Ruth Scrimgeour was. So they got on very well together, and she was the same age. He was tall, dark and handsome, said to be 7 foot, but I think he was only 6 foot. Yeah. So he came to Whispers. The big house here was built in 1875, and in those days and now the gentry have wicker furniture, so he was either making or mending wicker furniture for them, and he came over from Italy. That's what's odd, in that they were called James and John, the 2 gypsies, and they're actually buried in which churchyard? Not Liverpool, one past there. Anyway, it was quite interesting, really. She did an awful lot for them because with no fixed address, you couldn't get a vet, a lawyer, or a doctor, or any schooling. So she kept a governess here, Ruth Scrimgeour, who taught the gypsy children when they were here, and odd relatives of hers, and also village children, because they had to walk from the top of Stedham, which is on the A3, they had to walk 6 miles to school and back every day, and it was slightly closer here, it was only about 4 miles.
But going back to the Gypsies, so I
yes.
interrupted you. Do you remember them yourself then?
Well, they still come here, you see.
They still come here?
Yes, I mean, the problem was when I wasn't living here, Mr. Ricketts at the house would talk to them.
What's their surname?
Ray, R-A-E.
Ah.
And they come back quite frequently, and I take them to see her tomb. They always know, I mean, if you accused them, people of picking holly when they ought not to be or something or other, they would always say, it's all right. And this was 30 years after she'd moved. It's all right, we know Miss Scrimgeour. That they've got very, very long verbal memories and don't write anything down, so I'm always trying to get them up here I write it down, and they've got some photographs, so I need the photographs of their old relatives. And they had sort of 6 or 8 children. Most of the ones that were born in the 20s have died off because their health wasn't very good. But they'd come up, you know, very overweight and incapable with a horse, wanting to get a horse pony in the trap again, because they always want horses. And the gypsies we had near Madehurst had nothing to do with horses anymore. They were probably most mechanics, but they still used to like big dogs as well. That we had lurchers, and we sold or gave them a lurcher puppy. And they used to do a bit of sort of farming. They borrowed a pig now and then, that sort of thing. But they're very friendly, and I had a lot of experience of gypsies in London when I was working in hospital, because as soon as gypsies come in, all the staff say, "Look out, the gypsies are dirty, they'll steal everything." And honestly, considering they don't have piped water, they're the cleanest people. Gypsies, you know, they're not dirty people at all, but they are very frightened of going into hospital because, well, they get persecuted a bit, you know. Anyway, Ruth Scrimgeour was very, very good to them, so she knew. And she used to deal in horses, so she would buy a nice horse when they got one and
so that
sell
caravan then was theirs? Or was it,
that was theirs.
And how did it,
was
it given to you? Or?
Yes, it was given to us. Their daughter Rosie lived in it in Selsey, and one of the ones that used to come up here was a very small one with his small wife, and he was born in it. So what my elder sisters told me, sort of, and my mother too, sort of, it dated from the 1920s. Now, it didn't, because he was born in it in 1926. But she either died or moved into housing in 1928. So, and it did until some kind people were doing it up for me, removed it, have her initials on the side. But it's quite interesting, really, that they were made in Reading, the gypsy vans, and the first lot of these new age people who did it up for me, they stripped it down, and underneath it's green and black, the turning mechanism and everything. And the gypsies didn't have anything green or black. It wasn't that's superstition, yes.
Because green was unlucky, wasn't it?
Yes, and certainly my mother had a thing about green. So
driving in, we passed a house that said the old schoolhouse.
Yes.
So that was a school at some point then.
What happened? I've most of my studying around here has been collecting references for the common rights, because I had to register them all and find out about them all. In Stedham there was a tiny little one-room school which got a little bit bigger, but in 1860 the national schools were set up, so that one would have been 1860, that one there.
The one we passed?
Yes, and there was a gate. The common was gated before the days of the motor car. There was a gate there, and the boys used to sit on the gate, opening and shutting the gate for the first motorists or carriage drivers. So I didn't realise that when I turned up dressed rather smart for a do, she was horrified because I was wearing green. Khaki was the sort of colour, was all right, but not green. Anyway, it's quite obvious that the bases were horse-drawn army vehicles, which were done up for the gypsy specification in Reading.
After the First World War?
Yes. Well, no, after every war. I mean, this one's 1890.
Oh, right.
Yes. So, you know, army things are always for sale, aren't they? They have new vehicles, and there were a lot of aeroplane carcasses after the First World War. People used to make caravans out of First World War aeroplanes. Friends of ours did.
That's